Welcome to the Bells I Hear podcast. We will speak with experts who will debunk the myths and misconceptions surrounding homelessness and highlight the innovative approaches for addressing the issues, causes, and consequences of housing insecurity. I am Elisa Smith, your host, a mentor, professor of legal studies, and former public defender. Thanks for tuning in to the Bells I Hear. Welcome to the Bells I Hear, a podcast that amplifies the voices of youth, mentors, community leaders, and people experiencing housing insecurity. Our goal is to spread awareness about issues related to homelessness. I'm Elisa Smith, and today's host. Joining me today for a conversation about New York City's right to shelter is the Deputy Executive Director for Advocacy at the Coalition for the Homeless, Will Watts. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Watts.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So I think probably it makes sense to start by focusing on this very unique, New York City's right to shelter law. Let's
Absolutely.
talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I guess I should begin by acknowledging that I am new to New York in the sense that I've only been here for about 2.5 years and largely practiced law and did similar work in Los Angeles. So I am approaching this with that sort of perspective or that vantage point in mind.
Which is right, because it gives you a way to compare and contrast California to New York, which is
exactly. And as someone, who moved to this area from a city that does not have a right to shelter, I can definitely say that it's not only unique, but for me, it felt like a game changer, both for those that are experiencing homelessness, as well as anyone else who lives or works or just visits the city. And, and this is because, as monitors of the shelter system, the Coalition for the Homeless estimates that it's given over 1.5 million people a way off the streets. And, I guess I probably should have begun by acknowledging what the right to shelter actually is.
I was just going to ask, what is a right to shelter?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It essentially means that everyone in New York City, sort of regardless of their immigration status or what have you, has a right to be sheltered by the city if they have no other safe place to go. That's it in a nutshell. And it came about largely because of litigation. So one of our founders brought this case, Callahan v. Carey, which was very instrumental in establishing this right in New York City. And it essentially argued that under the New York State Constitution, there's a provision that's very unique that basically provides that the aid, care, and support of the needy are public concerns and shall be provided by the state in such of its subdivisions, basically localities and cities and what have you. And so that language shall be provided. It's not optional. It's a requirement. And so when that litigation was settled in 1981, it basically resulted in every homeless man in New York City having a right to a shelter bed and provided minimum standards for how the city should maintain its shelters.
So let me ask about that. How does the city decide who can and cannot afford shelter?
Mm-hmm.
And you said every man.
Exactly.
Does that mean that women and children were excluded from that lawsuit?
So the initial lawsuit only focused on men, but very quickly thereafter, in 1982, there was a separate case that was brought that expanded it to single adult women. And then fast forward, and in 2008, there was a case that was resolved that basically expanded it to families with children. And the approach to accessing shelter is very different for families than it is for singles. But generally speaking, anyone that needs shelter presents themselves at the relevant intake center, and they go through the process to access shelter.
Well, what kinds of information do they ask them for? Because the little bit of reading that I've started to do is that some of the barriers, and I'm sure there's others, and you can talk about what those barriers are, to getting help is that sometimes the government asks for things like your birth certificate or social security card. And those are things that sometimes individuals who are having these struggles don't have ready access to.
Absolutely. And for single adults, this is where the difference really becomes apparent. For single adults, it might be asking some of that information, but those are not supposed to be barriers to accessing shelter. They may be asking for that information because of wanting to be able to assess whether or not someone can access public benefits or other things that might help them on their journey and hopefully help them be able to exit the shelter system. For families, though, it's really different. Families have to go through a somewhat cumbersome process to basically establish that they are quote unquote eligible for shelter. And interestingly enough, not long after I started with the coalition, there was a particular incident that kind of really troubled me and reminded me of why it is that we sort of exist. And it was rooted in this difference in accessing shelter. The case basically involved a homeless couple with a 2-month-old, and they had gone to the intake center to go through this process to access shelter. And they had gone over a weekend and had gone twice and been denied twice. The reason was completely invalid because the city asserted that they had some other place to live. They could live in Illinois with a family member, but in consulting with that family member, it was very clear that they were not willing to and could not accommodate this family. Nonetheless, the city used that as a basis for denying them access to shelter. And so what the city did, they did basically turn this family out into the streets. And so that family ended up living in the park for a while, and the child became ill. And fortunately, they connected with us, and we were able to kind of get the family into shelter and onto their path of stability. But this case for me was just so egregious, both in terms of turning the family out to the streets when the city actually not supposed to do that. It was to give them a conditional placement while they go through this eligibility process. So the fact that they failed to do that was problematic. But it also just highlighted for me that for families, going through this eligibility process is both a barrier, but at the same time, just very disconcerting for the family that's going through whatever trauma they might be going through at that particular point in time. And we see this in the data. Eligibility rates basically that we have seen for October, that's the most recent month that is available now, so it shows that only 32% of families with children were eligible for shelter in October, and only 40% of adult families. So it's really low, and that's common.
Of the people who applied, 32% were given shelter. And when you say they were given shelter, or the people that were not given shelter, the 70% that were not given shelter, they have no other options except, as this family did, is to go sleep in a park or live outside.
Yeah, so hopefully they are in a conditional placement for some additional period of time, but that just means they're having to reapply. But nonetheless, yes, it does mean that they are relegated to other options outside of the shelter system. So even with this right to shelter, we have barriers to accessing it.
Right, and other places, I mean, I think this right to shelter is rare, right? There's only a few cities or maybe a state or two that has this kind of legal provision. Am I right?
That's correct. I mean, we're unique in the way in which we do right to shelter. I mean, I think the state of Massachusetts has something, but it's only for families, and it's not, I think, as robust in the same way. And I think there might be something that's weather activated in DC, but given the state of affairs in DC now, I'm not even sure what that looks like for the district.
So what happens, and we'll get back to New York's shelters and some of the systemic barriers, but I'd like to do a compare and contrast with other places. So for places that don't have a right to shelter or a process that allows people this opportunity to get shelter, what happens in those communities or in those states?
Yeah, well, using LA as an example, I mean, there are some shelters, but because there's no right to shelter, you don't have as robust of a shelter system. So that means the number of beds that are available for folks is not existing. I mean, you have in LA, I think it's 47,000 individuals that are living unsheltered, so in encampments and different places throughout the city or the county. You may have, like I said, about 20 some odd thousand beds that are available in the shelter system, but it's not coordinated, it's not as robust for those individuals. And so right now, folks are left to their own devices. They're left to live in their cars, live on the streets. Maybe people will be doubling up, and that's also a large segment of the population that we see here in New York too, because some people might want to try to use that as maybe a last resort before turning to the shelter system or these other alternatives. but you might find people that are couch surfing or doubling up with anyone that they might be able to for a period of time. But in some parts of the country, and especially if you don't have a support network or have connection to various resources, your only option may be living on the streets.
Yeah. And that's when you see these encampments
That's
or
correct.
people living in
Yep.
tents in parks along the highways and those sorts of things.
Exactly.
So even though New York has this right to shelter, it's
Mhm.
imperfect, as you've already described. What do you
Mhm.
think some of the most pressing systemic barriers are to individuals who are experiencing housing insecurity?
Yeah. I mean, it comes back to what the real solution is on some level too. One of the major systemic barriers is literally just enough housing to meet the need. And here in New York City, very much like in Los Angeles, the amount of housing that's available for those who are not only homeless, but very low income, extremely low income, is very limited. And so, take for instance, if you are a single individual here in the city and you're making up to $34,000, or you're a family of four making up to $48,000, you're not going to find an affordable place to live. I mean, some of the reports that come out a couple of years ago suggest that we only have a 0.4% vacancy rate in units that are renting under $1,100. And so that means that a lot of people are competing for very, very few available apartments. And this is more or less a reflection of the city's policies over the last decade of just underbuilding for those individuals at that end of the economic spectrum. We were looking at some data, and basically over that 10-year period, I think there were about 13,000 units of housing that came online for homeless households and for those that are extremely low income. So those numbers I was mentioning earlier. But that same number of units, we completed in only 3 years for those that are making $86,000 for a household of one, or $124,000 for a family of four. So it's not an issue of being able to construct. We find ways to construct it, but it's just that we have not been very targeted in constructing that housing for that lower end of the economic spectrum.
Yeah.
And so,
And I think that touches on one of the myths.
mhm.
And I do want to ask you what you think, what is the most prominent misconception you see in your work. But I think you've really touched on one of the myths. And then one of the myths is that people think homeless individuals aren't working. And that's not really true.
That's
Is
not true. No,
no.
no. I mean, and a lot of folks that are living in the shelter system, there are folks that are working and they just cannot afford a place to live. Or even if they have some income, just finding any available place, even with a housing voucher, sometimes can be very challenging in this particular market. And so, yes, people are working. People that are maybe sitting beside you on a subway, or delivering your meals, or providing some support for you in a healthcare setting. They very well could be living in the shelter system. It's just too expensive to afford a place to live in
Yeah.
New York. Yeah.
And that's in New York and even other places, right? I
Mhm.
think
It's true.
this
Yeah.
issue is now, you see it in the suburbs, you see it in
Mhm.
rural America, you see
Mhm.
it, it's pretty widespread. It's not
Pretty
just
smart.
an urban issue.
That's correct. Exactly.
Um, are there any other misconceptions or myths about that are preconceived notions that people have that are just not true?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of related to this in terms of like who is homeless. I think the media in large part kind of reinforces the notion of the unsheltered homeless individual as being more or less the stereotypical homeless person. And the data definitely does not support that, especially in New York. Here in New York, I know that these numbers are required by HUD, and the methodology sometimes is a bit challenging, but nonetheless, the estimates were that it's about 4,500 unsheltered individuals in New York City. Look at the shelter system, there are about, as of the end of October, about 102,000 individuals living in our city's care in shelters. So granted, the larger share is not on our streets. Now, of that 102,000, I think the other thing that is enlightening for folks is to realize that that's largely families, and there are about 35,000 children that are in shelter. So it's the makeup of who is homeless is not necessarily aligning with, I think, some of the common portrayals of individuals who are experiencing homelessness.
Yeah.
And then that doesn't even take into consideration those that are doubled up. We think that that's about another 200,000 people.
Right. And I think it's very difficult to count those numbers, right? Or at least the
They are.
government has had difficulty in accurately counting who's
Yeah,
doubling up and where people are.
exactly.
It sounds like one of the issues is that it's very difficult for people, even people who are sheltered, to move from kind of emergency or temporary housing to more long-term permanent housing, which of course I think would be the ideal. I'm right,
Absolutely.
right about
Yeah,
that.
that's exactly right.
So what's the disconnect? Why are we not able to assist people get to get more permanent, stable housing?
Yeah. Part of it is a supply issue, and definitely want to talk with you more about sort of the units that are available that we aren't tapping into. But another part of it is this construction element and needing to bring more housing to the market. And so we have actually a housing campaign that we're about to launch that is basically asking the city to really be intentional about bringing online about 12,000 units of housing each year for the next 5 years. I know it's an investment. It is a larger investment than we made in the past, but the goal is to make sure that those units are available for homeless households and those that are extremely low income in order to close that gap between those that are in shelter or other places that need that housing and the resources that actually exist to meet that need. So that's definitely one of the areas in which we are advocating, to make some change. But we know that that's one piece of the puzzle, right? That there definitely need to be look at other avenues to get people stably housed, whether it is housing vouchers or other means of making sure that people have what they need in order to be able to afford to live in New York City.
Right. So if someone were playing devil's advocate and said, well, why should we be expending our city resources to help individuals get sheltered? How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, there are multiple responses. I mean, on the human level, it's like it's the right thing to do, right? We definitely want to make sure that people are being treated in a dignified manner and that individuals are able to have the same access to permanency and a stable living situation that all of us enjoy, just from a humanitarian standpoint. Aside from that, I mean, it's just also not cost effective for us to continue to have individuals that are not able to be in permanent housing. I think it was the comptroller, Brad Lander, a couple of years ago, had put out a report around sort of housing first and some of the numbers around that. And some of the costs that he put out made it very clear that it costs us much, much less to house folks than it does to have them in any other space, whether it is a shelter, incarcerated, or in hospitals. Those numbers were around like $33,000 a year if someone's in, say, a supportive housing unit, which is permanent housing with supportive services. It was like 56,000 for shelter, but you start getting into the 500,000 when you talk about incarceration, millions when you start talking about hospitalization. So it's clearly the most cost-effective way to address this need.
Right. And I think you just touched on something else that I wanted to ask about. One of the other things you hear happening in other places where people are either forcing people into shelters, so people from the streets, and there's also a movement toward arresting individuals for living on the street, and in essence, criminalizing homelessness or people who live in public. What's the problem with those answers?
Yeah. Well, it's starting with the
We only have a short period of time. I realized how open-ended that was.
Well, it's just the wrong approach, and it's wrong because first, we're just not honoring people's dignity, right? We're treating them as criminals simply because they lack a permanent place to call home. So that it's just starting from the humanitarian aspect of it. But it's also the fact that evidence just shows that forcing people into these situations leads to worse outcomes because we're not addressing their real need. And even here in the city, even though we don't have maybe the same laws that some other parts of the country have, we do engage in encampment sweeps. And just looking at some of the data that was released that focuses on those sweeps that took place between January and June of this year, there were 1,093 individuals that were swept. Only 92 of them went into shelter or some other form of transitional housing. So clearly, moving them along in that way was doing nothing but
Right.
temporary relocation. That's
What
it.
happened to the rest of them?
We assume that the individuals just ended up returning to some place outside, and those were for the encampment sweeps. When you look at the involuntary transport, so the law provides that allows for individuals that appear to be mentally ill and unable to meet their basic needs to be able to be involuntarily transported to hospitals. So some of the data that we received around that suggests that there are about 6,000 of those that occurred. Now, that's not just unhoused individuals, but generally within the community. And the city has not released outcomes related to that. The closest we have is Commissioner Tisch making a statement a couple months ago saying something along the lines of, people are largely released within 2 hours with nothing other than a sandwich. So we know that there's a revolving door that's just happening between these places and the streets. And what that means is people are being upended, their belongings are probably being thrown away, and if they end up with a fine or arrest, then they're having yet another situation that they've got to deal with before they can be eventually stably housed and maybe be able to find jobs.
Right, because those outcomes actually end up erecting barriers to their ability to be eligible. Is that right?
Right. That's right.
So it's just this cycle of, confronting a barrier, getting another barrier, and it just accumulates, which becomes almost overwhelming.
It does. And unfortunately, because of some of the changes at the federal level, we're seeing an uptick in the number of places across the country that are deciding to criminalize as a way to address this issue. And we just expect that that's largely going to result in the same outcomes that we've seen thus far.
Right, that it's just going to be history repeating itself.
Correct.
Now there is a model that out there where unused resources were used to help veterans who were homeless. Do you think that could be successfully used as a template to help solve our current situation with, I guess, the 60 to 70% of people who are not becoming eligible for housing?
Oh, yeah. So the veteran model is really informative in many ways. I think, first of all, it shows us that with political will and government at all levels kind of working together, we can effectively end the chronic homelessness. I mean, that's what happened with veterans. We basically were able to eliminate chronic homelessness in 2015, and now we're at this level that's called functional zero, which basically just means that veterans are getting into permanent housing within 90 days of entering shelter. And so we've seen that this can work. It just requires a concerted effort at looking at what resources are available and the people that are coming through the system and matching them in a way that's going to address their needs. It's housing first. It's really looking at, no preconditions, just getting people housed and then dealing with the supportive services and needs that they have once they're so housed. We could do that. We have vacancies that are both NYCHA units, and we have vacancies that are supportive housing units. And from the numbers that we've seen, it suggests that there are about 5,900 vacant NYCHA units, and those could probably be very much available to address those individuals, those families that we were talking about. And then we have about 5,000 supportive housing units, which could be very much valuable for those that are unsheltered on our streets that are otherwise needing to come inside. Now, both sets of housing need repairs, and we recognize that that's a capital investment, and so we need to make sure that those dollars are there. NYCHA has reported that it's taking them about 423 days on average to turn over these units as new tenants need them. And they're saying it's because of the significant repairs that are needed. And in some cases, maybe some lead and asbestos testing.
Wait, you said over 400, it's over a year.
Over a year, exactly. And so that suggests to me that it's not just a capital issue, but there's probably some more insight that is required to understand why it's
Right.
taking that long and what is the extent of the repairs that are truly needed, so that we can make sure that these are not sitting vacant for many more years to come when we have thousands of individuals that need those
Right.
units.
It sounds
Yeah.
like there's if you can connect these two things, you have vacant
Mhm.
homes and you have people who need homes, you can
Yep.
connect those.
You connect those. Yeah.
So, so was the situation with veterans unique? Or, I mean, were there issues that they confronted and that you could learn from to make the same? I mean, you basically said there are no homeless veterans,
Mhm.
essentially. So
Yeah.
that would be ideal. How
Yeah.
how can we make that work for non-veteran populations?
Exactly. So part of it really is coordination and making sure that the various city, maybe even and with respect to some of these supportive housing units that are vacant now, state partners are working together to figure out how to streamline processes to get people into units. Because that's what it kind of boils down to. Because the vacant supportive housing units in particular, just given the way that those are financed, some of those structures that are there, it really does require, some effort to kind of think through how to kind of streamline these processes and remove red tape that has basically made it very difficult for people to access it.
Yeah.
And for some of those too, there is, like I said, some repairs that are required and some reconfiguration, because some of the supportive housing units might be designed in a way that are less desirable for the people who need them. They might be currently configured in a way that individuals share a bathroom, or they might have a roommate. And given the needs of the individuals that need to go into those units, that might not be the ideal situation. So it's a sort of all hands on deck is required, but it's just political will. It just requires people to feel that that is important to do, and they're willing to do what's necessary to move the deck chairs as necessary to make that matching happen.
Right.
Yeah.
And veterans, like other individuals who are experiencing housing insecurity, have other issues.
Mhm.
The housing first model, but
Mhm.
then once they have housing, there's food insecurity, there's mental health issues, there's underemployment issues. Are those also being addressed for the veterans? And is that also a model that could be adapted for these other populations?
Yeah, so the supportive housing that's being provided is, you have your permanent placement, and then you have the wraparound services that individuals particularly need. And so the vouchers that were used to support all of the housing for veterans are called VASH vouchers, and those vouchers not only provided support for the housing, but the supportive services. And so people were connected with the resources they needed. And, it varies. Some individuals need one set of resources and other things. The other thing that's unique, of course, for veterans, having worked with some veterans in Los Angeles, I know that, veterans have access to various disability benefits and other benefits that might not be the same or are paid at the same rate as benefits that might be available to other unhoused individuals who are non-veterans. But nonetheless, the process is the same, where it is having those resources available to them to really assess, have you maximized all of the public benefits or other benefits to which you were entitled that would then support your ability to stay stably housed. The same thing could happen with respect to the unhoused individuals that are non-veterans. They just need case managers and others to be deployed to be able to support them and make sure that they have what they need in order to remain stably housed.
And I mean, to me, it's logical, right? It makes sense that if you use a housing first model, people have housing, they have that stability, then
That's
we
right.
can address the other needs. We know where they
That's
are. They
uh-huh.
can store their documents safely. They can get access to the other, resources that they need.
Mhm.
I've also been reading a little bit about a movement. It's been around actually for a long time. I don't know how much traction it's got, but to move from a right to shelter, even though I recognize most places don't have a right to shelter,
Yep.
but to a right to housing.
Mhm.
What is the difference between a right to shelter and a right to housing?
Yeah, I mean, the basic thing is, as you described, I mean, in terms of what it is that people are actually accessing. Are they getting something that's temporary and it's meant to provide them with a bridge to something more permanent, or are they getting the thing that we hope will be their place, be able to reside over the long term? And there's definitely been a debate. This is a healthy debate that was going on in California while I was there, and I think that was in some ways why we never developed a right to shelter in California, is that there were some that felt like, why go there? Because we'll be stuck there. We won't actually be able to have what we ultimately want, which is housing. And I don't necessarily see it as an either or. I think that the right to shelter has provided us with a way to make sure that people are not in harm's way and they're not relegated to the streets. But it doesn't mean that we can't work towards having a right to housing and ensure that ultimately people are in the space such that we don't need the shelter system to be as robust as it currently is. So yes, I know that oftentimes they're often pitted against one another in some ways, but they don't have to be. I think that the ultimate goal, I know we always talk about here at the coalition, is that we want to work ourselves out of a job. And the only way to do that is if there's enough housing to ensure that people have what they need.
Right. So what do you think the most pressing issues are today that could be remedied with current resources?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think top of the list is dealing with these vacant units that we were just talking about, because we need to address the housing shortfall and the shortage there. And the easiest way to do that is to activate those vacant units. And to the extent it's just a matter of political will, then hopefully with the new administration, there will be more concerted effort to think about how do we kind of, for lack of a better word, get to that low-hanging fruit. And so that's a good place to start. We also think that there needs to be a commitment to thinking about how do we address the housing deficiencies at the lower end of the economic spectrum. It's not to say that we don't need housing for everybody. We definitely need affordable housing because the city is just expensive. But we can't continue to ignore the fact that we have not been building at the rate that we should be at that lower end. We're not going to solve this problem without doing so. So to have a commitment of making an effort to bridge that gap, we estimate that with a $3.2 billion capital funding commitment for each year for the next 5 years, that would help us to get to those units. But we know that that's one of many pieces of this puzzle. So those would be sort of the pressing ones in the short term. Activate the units and make a commitment to make those units available that we need to have available for the lower end of the spectrum.
Yeah. Are there any difficulties with encouraging that political will, because some individuals say, not in my backyard, I don't want these individuals in my building, I don't want them on my block, I don't want, that kind of counter movement? Is that part of the struggle?
It's part of the conversation for sure. And I think part of that is an education around, well, we want to make sure that what I'm hearing from people is that they don't want folks in their community in a particular way. But we don't know all about our neighbors half the time. We just know who it is that is presenting in a way that makes us uncomfortable, right? And so to the extent that people are stably housed and people are able to have the supports they need, then it seems like that's a win-win for everyone. So I think part of it is understanding what this actually means and what's the alternative. We continue to have people on our streets or in our subways and continue to treat this as a police situation as opposed to a housing situation.
Right.
So I think part of it's an education issue for sure.
Exactly. And I think that goes back to the earlier part of the conversation where we talked about the myths and misconceptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That people have these myths and misconceptions about what housing insecurity means and who these individuals are, as if they can as if they could point them out, and they really probably can't.
Yeah.
And so we almost have to change the narrative about what that means, so that we don't have these added barriers, unnecessary added barriers.
Absolutely. It's interesting because one of our clients had made a statement at one point, and it's just like, that kind of captures it very, very well. And he was just talking about, we are essentially your sons and daughters, fathers and mothers. Nothing has changed except that I just don't have access to a key in an apartment. So reframe this in such a way that people really do see these are our brothers and sisters, are they're neighbors. They are not our enemies.
Right.
They just need a place to live.
They need a place to live. Um, is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you think might be important for viewers to hear, know, those kinds of things?
Let's see. I know that we talked a little bit about sort of the changing on the federal side, and I think the only other thing I would acknowledge there is just that the changing policies at this time, I think mean even more that we need to be focused on how to address the needs, because we know, for instance, that the changes at the federal level mean more people are going to be without food stamps. We estimate that 300,000 people probably be without food stamps in New York City. More people will be without Medicaid. And some of the housing vouchers that the federal government has been providing, they've made it very clear that those are not going to continue. So we know about 7,000 of those are going to no longer be funded after next year. So all of the things that are happening on the federal level are going to destabilize and undermine sort of the progress that we've made. And so as much as the instinct might be to think about doubling down and ordering resources, this is the time that we have to make investments, because we know that more and more individuals are going to enter into the city's care without those investments. So I think it's more just recognizing that the federal changes really are suggesting that this is more of a crisis than it may have. Not that it wasn't a crisis to begin with, but even more so.
Right. It's exacerbating an already
yes,
dire situation.
That's right.
So it's
yeah, and we're seeing yeah. Yeah, because there are more longer-term New Yorkers that are entering into shelter. We've seen that during the Adams administration, about 10,000 more longer-term New Yorkers were entering shelter. So as we see, the shelter census numbers sometimes are a bit misleading, because what we're seeing is that the new arrivals are leaving the system. And as a result, it suggests that the numbers are coming down. But when you get beneath the surface, you begin to see that what's happening is the longer-term New Yorker numbers are going up and not leaving shelter fast enough, because they have the places to go. So.
Right, because they don't have access to permanent housing.
Yeah.
So given that the trajectory looks a little bleak in terms of what's going to be happening, if people are interested in either learning more, helping, where do they go for information? Where, if you were going to suggest the greatest need that people could address, where do they go for that information? What do they do?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to acknowledge that I'm grateful for you guys having this forum, because this is a great place for people to get informed about these issues and to have people that are doing that work to be guests. So thank you for having this forum and having this space, because it is critical for people to be educated, not only for their own purposes, but also to help shape policy discussions. And as we have new electeds coming into office, to hold them accountable for what it is that we want to see happen in our city. So my recommendation would be just continue to stay connected with organizations like us. You can go to our website, www.coalitionforthehomeless.org, and there you can stay informed about everything from policy work that we're engaged in. You can sign on, endorse some of our policy platforms. But you also can just keep informed about the actions that might be taking place, some of the issues that we're engaged in, and you can volunteer and support the work in other ways too. So I would encourage folks to do that, because that's a good way at least to have the facts, as well as to have a sense of sort of what the impact is of some of the policy recommendations and changes that we might begin to see over the months and years to come.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, so staying engaged, getting information, going to the coalition website. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been really informative. I've learned a lot. Hopefully everyone who's listening to this has learned a lot as well. And, one listener at a time will knock down those false narratives, those misconceptions. So
exactly.
So thank you for joining us on The Bells I Hear. We post all of our conversations on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. You can connect with us on Instagram and post comments and questions that we can address during upcoming shows. For our next podcast, we will have two guests, Michael Santos, who is the American Bar Association Chair on Homelessness and Poverty, and John Pollock, who is the coordinator for the National Coalition for Civil Rights to Counsel. They will talk about the connections between homelessness and evictions. So if there's anything anyone would like to hear or learn about evictions and housing insecurity, please drop us a comment. And thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Bells I Hear podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the Bells I Hear and follow us on social media. We post all of our conversations on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. You can connect with us on Instagram and post comments or questions that we can address on upcoming shows. More information can also be found on Blogger and Substack. So many ways to learn about the issues surrounding housing insecurity. Please join us and contribute to the conversation.